Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, an unrehearsed panel discussion of the U.S. government's wars and the racism they inspire. We're recording this at noon on Tuesday, April 26th in the studios of Urbana Public Television in Urbana, Illinois. Our program is presented by members and friends of AWARE, a local peace group. The name AWARE stands for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. AWARE was established 14 years ago after the counterattacks in New York and Washington on 9/11/2001. The founders of AWARE were citizens of Champaign-Urbana who realized that the U.S. government would use the 9/11 crimes to justify its already long-standing attempts to exercise military control over the Middle East and its energy resources. The U.S. doesn't need oil from the Mideast, but Mideast gas and oil are needed by America's economic competitors in Europe and Asia. So control over them gives the U.S. a major advantage over China, Germany, and other countries. That control benefits only the American economic elite, the 1%, and not Americans in general, who've seen wealth concentrate in fewer and fewer hands at an accelerating rate over more than a generation. The U.S. wars are not in the news. The presidential candidates are a distraction, while the U.S. government continues to kill people around the world. And it seems clear that Hillary Clinton, as president, would continue the pro-war and pro-Wall Street policies of the Obama and Bush administrations. Whatever else one may think about Donald Trump as a presidential candidate, his foreign policy views should be welcomed for their challenge to the bipartisan neocon, neoliberal principles and practices that have guided Washington policymaking since the 1990s, with disastrous results. Both parties see the U.S. as the only country with a right to intervene wherever it so decides, by military means and regime changes, and by using NATO as its own United Nations rulemaker, from Iraq and Libya to Ukraine and Syria. The results have been death and destruction, wars both proxy and civil, growing terrorism, failed nation building, mounting refugee crises, and a new Cold War with Russia. Trump proposes instead diplomacy, or deals, towards forming partnerships, including with Russia, rethinking the rightful mission of NATO, Europe taking political and financial responsibility for its own crises, as in Ukraine, and an end to U.S. interventions around the world, a less missionary and militarized American national security policy. Trump is in fact calling on an older Republican foreign policy tradition, an anti-war tradition excoriated as isolationism by pro-war U.S. politicians since the 1930s. Trump is emerging as a realist in two respects. In reality, the world is no longer unipolar, pivoting around Washington, and the United States must share and balance power with other great powers, from Europe to Russia and China, instead of trying to destroy their influence, as the Obama administration is. But the orthodox bipartisan establishment, Republican and Democrat alike, have reacted with horror to Trump's anti-war proposals. The neocon War Party has said they will leave the Republicans and support Mrs. Clinton, a proven warmonger. It's possible that this existential confrontation might lead, if the mainstream media were to do their job, to the public debate over U.S. foreign policy that has been missing for a generation, and certainly during the 2016 presidential campaign. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's anti-war statements are part of their popularity. Remember that the anti-war movement in the U.S. was crucial to Obama's election both times, in 2008 and 2012, against McCain and against Romney. And Obama betrayed it both times by expanding the wars. Today, the Obama administration continues to bomb and assassinate people around the world and manages largely to distract Americans from what they're doing. Obama's real accomplishment as president has been to hide American war-making from the American people. Most Americans don't realize that President Obama has attacked 8 countries, 2 more than George Bush, and is today sending U.S. troops into no less than 3/4 of the countries around the world. There are more than 70,000 of these U.S. Special Operation Forces, and they report only to the President's National Security Council. Their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. Meanwhile, the president's continuing drone assassinations, the New York Times says he chooses the targets himself, have already killed thousands, including U.S. citizens and hundreds of children. In addition to conducting wars throughout the Mideast, the Obama administration is acting with belligerence towards China and promoting an ongoing proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, which has already killed more people than Israel killed, with U.S. permission, in Gaza in 2014. President Obama says he's fighting terrorism, the Islamic State, and al-Qaeda. But America's worldwide violence is creating terrorists, not defeating them. Worse, the U.S. is today covertly cooperating with those terrorists, the people who committed 9/11, notably in Syria. The U.S. created modern jihadism 40 years ago during the Carter administration, when the U.S. collected the most fanatic Islamists it could find and sent them into Afghanistan before the Russians sent troops there, specifically to frighten the Russians, as today in Ukraine, and, quote, give the Soviets a Vietnam of their own, in the words of President Carter's National Security Advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. Under CIA's Operation Cyclone from 1979 to 1989, the United States and Saudi Arabia provided $40 billion worth of financial aid and weapons to almost 100,000 mujahideen and Afghan Arabs from 40 Muslim countries through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI, and sent them into Afghanistan. One of the people involved in that American subversion of Afghanistan was the young Osama bin Laden, whose organization, al-Qaeda, that's what al-Qaeda means, would perpetrate the 9/11 attacks. Although control of the Mideast energy resources was the real reason, the Bush and Obama administration launched wars in the Mideast and killed well over 1 million people with the propagandistic excuse that they were fighting terrorism. But what, after all, is terrorism? U.S. law and U.S. Army manuals define terrorism as, quote, the calculated use of violence or threat of violence to attain goals that are political, religious, or ideological in nature through intimidation, coercion, or instilling fear, close quote. In other words, the military operations themselves of the Bush and Obama administrations are terrorism by their own definition. But when the U.S. government and media refer to terrorism, we all know that they mean terrorism practiced by foreigners against us, not the terrorism, often more extreme, practiced by the U.S. and its clients against others, particularly in the Mideast. So it becomes clear that Noam Chomsky is correct when he says, everyone's worried about stopping terrorism. Well, there's really an easy way. Stop participating in it. He's pointed out that Obama's secret drone program is the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times. The U.S. is largely responsible for the 9 wars now going on between North Pakistan and Northwest Nigeria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Southwest Turkey, Yemen, Libya, South Sudan, Northeast Nigeria, and Somalia, part of a post-Cold War pattern in which states that had achieved independence and self-determination were destroyed or weakened by foreign intervention, fueling and exacerbating internal discontents. There's a mix of on and off imperial intervention, sectarian war between Shia and Sunni, conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, dictatorship, and revolution. 40 years ago, the U.S. government withdrew from an illegal war because Americans demanded it. By 1969, polls showed that 70% of the U.S. population regarded the war in Vietnam as not a mistake, but as fundamentally wrong and immoral. As in Southeast Asia then, so now in Southwest Asia, the U.S. must end its criminal war. We must demand that President Obama and his successor, probably Clinton, end the drone assassinations, bring all U.S. troops and weapons home, close the 1,000 foreign U.S. bases around the world, no other country has more than 12, end the provocations of Russia and Ukraine and China in the South China Sea, end support for Israel's apartheid policy and stop sending them money and weapons, and finally, support negotiations among the U.S., Russia, and their clients to end the Syrian and Iraqi civil wars. In a book on the last presidential campaign, President Obama is quoted as follows: "Turns out I'm really good at killing people," Obama said quietly. "Didn't know that was going to be a strong suit of mine." However ironically he meant it, the quote has not been denied by the White House, and it turns out to be true. There's a lot of news about U.S. government war-making this week, but you won't hear much of it in the American media. We'll mention some of it tonight, beginning with Ron Zook.
Yes, I want to barrel quickly through a number of points. More and more I have this sense that I'm living in a cartoon, and it's more and more difficult to take anything very seriously. But there's a surge in Syria now. We're going from what was supposed to be 50 troops up to 250 more, and there's a good deal of talk about mission creep and resource creep and so on. We're going to be supplying those people with more armaments, intelligence information, and so on. So where did this craze of regime change come from? It has had devastating consequences in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, and now Syria. And why can't we get over it? Well, part of it, I suppose, is that the need to divide the world up into good guys and bad guys. We're the good guys, of course, in the white hats, and we have to characterize those that we oppose or who seem to be challenging our dominance somewhere as bad guys in the black hats. And we learned in the Bush years that we were engaged in apparently a cosmic struggle against evil, and we were going to deal with that militarily and with America's invincible armaments and so on. So this is so crazy in my view that I find it difficult to talk about it seriously. But anyway, a few other points. As we prepare for war in South China Sea, in the Middle East, and so on, will there be time to reflect and think about what we've done and how this happened? Some say that wars begin 10 years before the first shot is fired, and that means that the first inklings, thoughts, notions that there should be or might be or could be a war rise in people's minds, because that seems to be the first thing that they think about. And it's all, of course, in tune with the American view of what some have called eliminationism, that all of our problems are caused by bad people who are plotting against us, and the job is to identify those people and to eliminate them, and then our problem will presumably be solved. That is just so wrong that, again, I find it hard to think about it or to say anything cogent about it. So let me say some things that are not so cogent. Let's play a little game here. I'm having trouble being serious today. Cool or sucks? So tell me, Karen and Carl, the Virginia governor has restored voting rights to some 200,000 ex-felons, which sounds like a good move to me. But what do you think, Karen? Cool or sucks?
I think it's cool.
Cool. What do you think, Carl?
You want my view of that?
Yeah.
Sure. I lived in Virginia for a long time, voted for various and sundry people in Virginia, most of whom didn't make office and so forth. Yeah. I'm very happy to see that the that this obvious mistake is being rectified in Virginia.
Yeah. Okay. Next one. Cool or sucks? In Illinois, there's a movement to restrict the use of solitary to a maximum number of days and so on. Solitary confinement is now officially defined by the United Nations as torture. There, according to the story I've seen, somewhat over 1,830 people confined in solitary confinement in Illinois, and seems to be frequently increasing. Can we do anything about that? What about this movement to restrict the use of solitary? Cool or sucks?
I would say cool, but it depends on the maximum and how they define it.
Yeah.
Because there's always that, legalization.
Yeah.
They could make the maximum such a great number that it would not be cool.
Yeah, yeah. Carl, what do you think?
Well, of course. I mean, the notion that it's torture seems to me to be clear, and the movement against it is worthwhile. It may be once again, one thing that should be done in a much larger campaign.
Oh, sure.
When the U.S. Imprisons more of its fellow citizens than any country in the world, and we do it with racial dimensions to it that we owe to the first Clinton administration. There's a lot of room for reform in the prisons, and we should begin by stopping torture, yes.
Next point. In Illinois, Chicago State University is scheduled to close down completely due to zero state funding. What do you think?
That's so ridiculous. I'm sorry.
Cool or sucks?
I can't respond to that. It's totally ridiculous. I mean, it is ridiculous when you see the salaries and the money that is being paid
Yeah,
out.
yeah.
I can't even respond to that.
Carl?
This is a little far from our remit in terms of American wars, but it is bound up.
I think it's closely related to racism. But.
It is bound up with the political changes in the state of Illinois and the Republican governor. I think the biggest scandal, perhaps, in the politics is the stance of the Democrats who control the state legislature, that this is all the Republican governor's fault. Republican governor is a pretty bad guy. He's a neoliberal example of contemporary politics in both parties, but he would not be able to do what he is doing without the lying connivance of the Democrats in the state legislature, who could have ended this budget impasse that supposedly leads to this to this policy by passing a budget and funding it. Which they had the votes to do. They chose not to, because to do so would offend their rich backers in the state, their LaSalle Street cronies, the people for whom the Democratic Party in the state is working, the 1% in Illinois, as the Democratic Party in the country is working for the 1% in the country as a whole. So at least Governor Rauner, for all his neoliberal activities, such as the one you described, is honest about what he's doing. The state Democrats aren't. Vote against incumbents.
Yeah. Okay, final point. Related phenomenon in Kansas, the tax cuts advocated by Governor Brownback are apparently ruining the state. The argument is, coming from Governor Brownback and some people, like-minded people, that if we cut taxes enough, business activity will be increased, and government revenue will actually increase as a result. This has been tried in Kansas, and even most of the Republicans now seem to be complaining about this and saying the state is the educational system and all government activity and agencies in the state are being ruined, and stop. Let's get over this. But in some quarters, there's still a devout belief in what is called the Laffer curve. That is the amount of government revenue that you get from various tax rates, and it's kind of a little hill on the graph. So with a low tax rate, you get low government revenue. As you raise the tax rate, you get more up to some point, and then when you raise the tax more beyond that, you get less government revenue because of the businesses flee the state or the jurisdiction, whatever, and there's less economic activity. So we're finding out, this seems to appeal to a lot of people on kind of a priori grounds, that it stands to reason that businesses will decline if they're overtaxed, but it doesn't seem to be working out. And we have a good deal of empirical evidence now about that in a number of instances. So there, I'll stop.
Thank you, Ron. You're watching Aware on the Air. We'll turn to Karen Aram and pivot to Asia, perhaps.
Well, somewhere in Asia anyway.
Okay.
Yeah, my focus is, of course, war and all that is related. I didn't come really prepared. A couple things that have bothered me related to the media recently. I've mentioned it before that I see such propaganda coming from CNN and Fareed Zakaria. He's very good at interspersing some truth and then bringing in what I see as U.S. propaganda. And so it bothers me because I know there are a lot of people that are not online, they're not focused on politics, they don't see what the big deal is, and they get their news from CNN. And if you don't really understand what's happening, you could be molded into this robot viewer scenario that I think they're going for, the corporate-owned media is trying to play with, in order to present this fear of terrorism. This is what they're shoving down our throats. Everything is about terrorism. Now, even something that happened, I think it was yesterday, there was a missionary in the Philippines who had been kidnapped by the Abu Sayyaf, and he was beheaded because no one paid the ransom. Now, they refer to Abu Sayyaf as a terrorist group, okay? No, they are not. They do instill terrorism and inspire terrorism, but bin Laden would have nothing to do with Abu Sayyaf, okay? They actually made contact with him, and he wouldn't have anything to do with them because they've been kidnapping specifically missionaries who go into that part of the world, okay? They've been kidnapping missionaries since back in the 90s. And that was not bin Laden. I mean, he was an ideologue, okay? So, and he just said they're just out for money. They only want money. So he wouldn't have anything to do with them. Then there's the Moro group, which on occasion is referred to as terrorists, like when we went in December 2014, not officially, but it was many of our U.S. Personnel, former military personnel or current military personnel, before we went in recently and set up our bases again, and we used drones to kill a lot of the Moro. We also killed a lot of Filipino military people. But what we really did, and I think this was the whole goal, was to kill the peace accord that the Filipinos, the diplomats, had been working on for many years. Walden Bello, who I think you're familiar with, Carl, wrote about this, and he actually resigned from the parliament as a result because it was the Aquino president that did that. And again, it's because the Moro group, they should not be referred to as a terrorist group. They are a separatist group. They are trying to bring about they have a separatist movement that's been going on for forever and ever. And they had come to an agreement, and that's when the U.S. had to get involved and start breaking the agreement, breaking the trust between the Filipino government and the Moro group, and now start labeling them as terrorists. I know that there's a lot going on. Carl, you sent me an article from the Eurasia group or whatever out of Singapore talking about the Malay movement in Patani. Patani is south of Thailand, and it gives the impression that there's a strong separatist, and then they sort of throw in that word terrorist at them. And I've been predicting for a long time that this is to get the U.S. to allow their military bases to be brought back into Thailand. Now, we have a presence in Thailand. No one can deny that. When we do exercises, military exercises, we bring in our troops and we train the people in those nations. And we are providing people with weapons. And we know that the former Air Force Base in Takli, that was a U.S. Air Force base where we had our base, our airplanes and our bombers until 1976, I believe it is, right after the fall of Vietnam, that the Thais, and that was due to the people protesting against having the U.S. military base there, removal. They were removed. And yet, we know that that is one of the black, I think they call it black places, I'm not sure what they call it, prisons, where we torture people.
Black
So
site.
black site? Is that
Site,
what you- Okay. That's where we would kidnap people, usually Muslims from various different countries, and then we would take them offshore, of course, if not Guantanamo. Then we had these black sites elsewhere, and one of course is Takli Air Force Base, where we had people tortured. So anybody who thinks that we don't have a military presence or a CIA presence or operations going on throughout Southeast Asia, please really think again. They are there and they have been active. They just haven't built up the military bases yet, as they are going to do and are doing currently in the Philippines with the potential for 5 military bases. But they've gone back into Clark, they've gone back into Subic. Okay. Now, what you were referring to, Ron, and about regime change and something to the effect that 10 years in advance, when a war is planned, 10 years in advance of the first shot being fired, I do believe that's accurate. I don't know if it's 10 years, it might only be 5 years, but it's not a spur of the moment thinking. They plan in advance. And we see this. I'm finding out more and more, even going back and reading about the war after the war in Vietnam. It's the Third Indochina War, whereby in 1979, China attacked Vietnam. I never really knew what the causes were. Well, one reason, of course, was that they wanted to punish the Vietnamese for the poor treatment of the Chinese in Vietnam. They also wanted to punish them for invading Cambodia. And Deng Xiaoping felt very betrayed by the fact that they had poured so much money into Vietnam, only to then have them betray them. Although China was clearly supporting Cambodia, and the Soviet Union was supporting Vietnam. But at the end of the day, the real major reason for it all was to counteract Soviet influence. The fear that the Soviets were going to set up military bases in Vietnam. And the U.S. was very supportive. There were a lot of meetings took place with Brzezinski and Holbrooke, and Deng met with Carter. And so many meetings took place in advance in order to get U.S. support for China to go in. Because what China wanted and what the U.S. wanted was normalization of relations between the two of them, again, to counteract Soviet Union. That was their biggest concern, their biggest fear at the time. So there's almost always a geostrategic reason behind so much of what is happening. And I think that what we're looking at now, it's the same situation. Like Libya, someone mentioned the other day that a lot has been written about the fact that Gaddafi wanted to change, I'm not saying this correctly, change the currency. How would you refer to that? He wanted to bring in his own currency instead of using dollar currency for the purchase of oil, which they had. And I'm sure that was a component. But there were so many other components as well.
Well, there was an earlier story about the invasion of Iraq. There was this talk that Saddam Hussein was thinking about converting from petrodollars to euros,
Right,
which
but
would have had been an
Right.
enormous impact.
Right. But my point is that these things will have an enormous impact. And these are one reason why we go in. But there are so many other reasons as well. I mean, we know it's about the oil. We know that it's also about the fact that China had so much investment in Libya. It's also about the strategic location of Libya between. So there usually is not just one reason. There are usually a couple reasons, and that's why the planning starts. back at the beginning with the strategic causes, and that's what we're seeing in China, in the South China Sea right now, with the buildup of our warships, our military in the South China Sea against what we call China aggression, but we know what they really mean is the business aggression. We also know that the economics situation that is taking place now is hurting these nations. And then we have NATO on the border of the Ukraine, right there on the border of Russia. So this has all been planned so far in advance, and we know all you have to do is read Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard that he published in 1997, and it's all spelled out right there. And he was Carter's most influential advisor. He is one of Obama's most influential advisor. He represents the corporations, but he also was an advisor to the Reagan administration. And I know personally that Republicans that supported Reagan were supporting Brzezinski when Carter was elected. And I know for a fact this is true because I heard about Brzezinski before Carter was actually elected. So there's no doubt in my mind that there is such a similarity between the parties when it comes to foreign policy. I don't know about domestic anymore. But I know that a domestic leader right now with the Democrats, they're not doing anything about our economic situation. But as you pointed out, Ron, excuse me, there were 250 troops, ground troops, were sent in to Syria just this weekend, I think. Right. The week before it was 217 ground troops were sent in. And I mean, all of these ground troops are there to support the air war, our air forces that are there. So when we hear our president saying one thing like, well, we don't want intervention, and I actually saw him being interviewed by Charlie Rose on the Charlie Rose Show last week, and I was appalled. He again, like Fareed Zakaria, they're very, very good at promoting propaganda and BS. They'll say in one vein, they'll be saying, well, we don't want regime change. We don't want to intervene in these nations, blah, 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 blah. But then they will come up with, but of course, you know, Syria, I mean, the dictatorship there is so bad. It's really, really appalling when you hear them say one thing and then you watch and you see them doing quite another. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Karen. You're watching Aware on the Air. We're talking about the U.S. government's wars and war policy and how that works out around the world. The various examples we've mentioned, I think, are presenting us with as Americans, American voters too, as a very real problem in distinguishing the propaganda accounts of why the U.S. is taking actions, usually actions to kill people, military actions around the world, and the actual goals that the U.S. government is pursuing around the world. We don't have too much trouble making that distinction when in historical affairs, if we're talking about Europe in the 1930s or Asia in the 19th century. We can usually distinguish what the various regimes said about what they were doing from what they were actually doing, as shown over a substantial period of time. The two examples that Karen has raised this evening, the ethnic struggles in the Philippines and Malaysia and elsewhere on the one hand, and the question of U.S. policy, U.S. and Chinese policy in Southeast Asia after the Vietnam War. Both of these, I think, require us to penetrate the America's propagandistic account of what the U.S. was doing. It wasn't rolling back communism and stopping the world spread of communism when it went into Vietnam, for example, and give an account of why the U.S. Thinks it's justified in killing people in these various situations. We don't have any trouble making those distinctions for other governments. We do have a fair amount of trouble making that distinction for our government, in part because the explanations that our government asks are directed to us. There is, after all, only one real enemy that the American government fears, and that is an American populace that will trammel up somehow that government's activities on behalf of the American 1%. That has to be prevented. That has to be lied out of. We've seen specific examples of lies about that by the American government in recent years, such as lies for the invasion of Iraq. And not too many people now would have much trouble distinguishing what the U.S. government said it was doing when it invaded Iraq and what it was actually doing and why it was actually doing it. That's pretty clear. But in other areas, and particularly as we get closer to the present, it's harder and harder to do that. There's one specific aspect of that Karen's first comment brings that I think is worth paying attention to, and that's the question of the U.S. aiding governments, particularly Asian governments, against ethnic separatist movements, such as the Moros in the Philippines. Why does the U.S. do that? Why does the U.S. aid those governments against those ethnic separatist movements? Why does the U.S. hate those ethnic separatist movements? Well, that's a question mal posé in the sense that the U.S. doesn't hate the movements. What the U.S. wants is a clientage relationship with that government to use for its own purposes, in this case, the containment, in quotes, of China.
Right.
It needs the Philippines and Malaysia on its side in its Asian policies. And this is an aspect of the American policy set out explicitly and in so many words at the end of the Second World War that the U.S. government, with 5% of the world's population and 50% of the world's wealth, simply has to continue to control the worldwide economy, to maintain the disparity, as George Kennan said in 1949. Now, maintaining this disparity in this case means keeping Russia and China in place, and there's been specific moves to do that, particularly since the fall of the Soviet Union, and specifically since the rise of China. But in the specific programs that the American government follows in Asia, the overall consideration of the economic hegemony of the American 1% is always foremost. That's top of the list. So when we talk about why does the U.S. Support the Philippine government against ethnic separatist movements, we should look at the parallel in Southwest Asia. Why does the U.S. support the Israeli government in its apartheid regime against the Palestinians? Not because the U.S. government particularly hates Palestinians or Arabs or anyone else. There are plenty of people that it may hate, but that's not the issue. That's not the issue. What the U.S. needs is the clientage relationship with Israel. What the U.S. needs is a stationary aircraft carrier in the Middle East, which is what Israel gives it. And therefore, the U.S. puts up with Israel's suppression of its own internal minority, it's not quite a minority anymore, if you want to put it that way, the Palestinians, and turns, and indeed supports the vicious policy of Israel against the Palestinians. It's not about the Palestinians, although they're the ones who are dying. But we as Americans should understand it's about American policy, and that's what we should be talking about. Comments?
Carl,
Yeah.
one other thing I think should be brought up is that, excuse me again, is in regards to regime change, we hear about it now, but we were applying it in the 50s. I mean, we brought about regime change in Iran, in Guatemala.
Oh, sure.
I just found out that in 1949 we were responsible for regime change in Syria. I have no details on that. I didn't know that. But I'm sure it took place previous to that, and as historians, the two of you can mention that. But I think it's now, I do think we're more open somehow. It's more obvious because of the internet, that it's more obvious what we're doing. And we just go about doing it and sometimes open about it because, oh, well, he's a bad guy, or oh, he's a dictator, he's got to go. Yeah. I think it was much more secretive. I mean, in Indonesia in 1965, even though we had Eisenhower bombed them in the 50s, it was all about controlling the government there. So I think that is what most of it's about. And I think we're just going to hear more. And as I said, I heard Obama in one breath saying, well, we don't want to bring about regime change, or we don't want to intervene or do anything like that. He said it much more eloquently. And then in the next breath, next paragraph, third paragraph or so, in speaking with Charlie Rose, he did say, well, you know, Assad, he's a really evil dictator or something to that effect, that he has to go. And it's like, here we go again. So, you know, it's amazing to me how they get away with that.
Yeah, another factor is that it's easier, I think, to buy off these governments in many places than the nationalists who are rebelling against them and leading separatist movements and so on.
Right.
Again, there's the theory, which I think has a good deal of validity, that there's the politically active part of the population, the top 20%, who will yield to American blandishments of money, contracts, military goods, and so on. And it's far more difficult to get the nationalists to do that, who are fighting for some kind of autonomy in their area and so on. But
Well,
that's an ongoing
right. I mean,
problem.
well, Ho Chi Minh turned to the U.S. for assistance in fighting for their autonomy from France, but we refused to help him, and because we supported France, and as a result, then he turned to the Soviet Union, and so then we had to get involved. I mean, yeah.
As Colonel Gaddafi and others have discovered to their dismay, the U.S. follows the rules set up by Lord Palmerston in the 19th century when he said, he was speaking, of course, of Great Britain, Britain had no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests.
Yes, yes.
And that is the motto of governments. And from time immemorial, we look at the particular form of it in America today, where the rulership is in the hands of the 1% of an economic elite, and it's the permanent friend, no permanent friends, no permanent enemies of that economic elite, but only the interests of that economic elite that are pursued by the government. And as Ron was suggesting, that may have some peculiar effects when there are nationalist revolts and whatnot in other parts of the world. A nationalist revolt that loses is of no interest to the U.S., and the U.S.
Right.
is perfectly happy to support a government that it wants as a client in suppressing that. However, if the nationalist revolt looks like winning, the U.S. will suddenly discover that it is willing to support that government too if it's biddable, if it will do what the U.S. asks. The recent Egyptian experience is an example of that, where the U.S. moved from a dictator who was losing support to what it thought was a nationalist movement that had support, and then finding out that and supporting that movement, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, then finding that it did not have an effective, that its writ didn't run throughout Egypt, and therefore the U.S. immediately abandoned that and went over to the military, which threw out and killed the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the development is perfectly consistent with a consistent American foreign policy. It may be immoral, you say, they're willing to kill these people for reasons that they're not with the program, but still in all, that's indeed what the U.S. is doing. Treason never prospers. What's the reason? If treason prospers, none dare call it treason, right?
Yeah.
So if the if the nationalist movements win, they suddenly can find friends in Washington, as Gaddafi himself did
Right.
for a while.
Exactly. Well, on that topic, too, I want to mention, that's why I'm reading Brother Enemy of the War After the War by Nyan Chanda again. I mean, this was written in the, published in the 80s, is because he goes into so much detail regarding how the U.S., how Brzezinski, Holbrooke, Vance, and how there was infighting amongst them. I mean, it was pretty bloody between them. Holbrooke almost lost his job. He was trying to build bridges with Vietnam and with Cambodia. But how we work with the leaders of both nations, as well as we were working with the leaders of China. So, and yet it was all about the Soviet Union. So that is one of the reasons I like this. And so far I haven't come across anything that I view as being propaganda against any particular nation. and we have to keep in mind that the U.S. has very good relations with the heads of the military. And when I say heads, I mean it's not just like one leader like Sisi, because I know in Thailand they have different factions within the military. They always have, and we've actually had coups whereby one military faction is going against the other military faction, and so they have to. Most of the time, they prop up one government, and the U.S. will try to prop up one group or one government, and then one faction of the military, which we've often educated, trained, etc. Sometimes at the expense of not having the best relations with the other military faction. And I think this is what we're seeing right now, where the military faction in charge after the coup in Thailand, they're closer to China. But again, the Asians have been playing this game so much longer than we have, and I have no doubt in the Middle East it's the same thing. So they know how to play us for what we're worth, to get as much money out of us as they can, as well as to get whatever they see as strategically necessary for their own survival, which was another thing. You also had Deng Xiaoping and the leaders of China going to deal with the leaders. I see a lot in here dealing with the leaders of Thailand at the time and Malaysia, trying to, promise them security against Vietnam. This was in the late 70s. So there's so much going on, and it is complex. It's never really very simple. You have to dive into it, and you have to really read into the books to discover what's really happening.
Don't you see outlines of some of the same phenomena in a number of places, like South Africa, where we supported
Absolutely.
a repressive government
Yes.
for as long as possible until the explosion comes?
Right.
In Latin America,
Right.
again and again.
Again and again, exactly. We're particularly awful. Like right now, we know that there's, I guess you call it a legal coup taking place in Brazil. And I mean, they're coming up with all kinds of, I mean, I've seen this on the Peter Lavelle show, Crosstalk, but also keep in mind Pepe Escobar has been reporting on it. He is actually from Brazil. Yes, it's a corrupt government, but all governments in Brazil, I've said this about all governments in Thailand, are corrupt. And basically, it's just a matter of we got to destroy the BRICS. And so we're starting with Brazil.
BRICS, you mean BRIC,
The
Brazil,
banking.
Russia.
Brazil, Russia, India, China,
Yeah.
and South Africa.
Yeah.
And I mentioned a couple weeks ago that there is a lot of protest and dissension going on in South Africa against the government, but I warn people to be very cautious about how we view this, because when you look who's behind the scenes, it's a U.S. organization, which I mentioned, and that woman, Ann, I can't think of her last name again, that kicked you off her blog, Carl.
Ann Armstrong.
I mean, yeah, really, I mean, and I hate to say it, but here again, really awful people, because they support war and around the world, literally. That's their job. So they support and they prop up groups, and sometimes these groups are legitimate protesters, demonstrators, nationalist people who want to rid corruption. But sometimes they'll take support from the U.S., and this is what I see happen in Burma, and I was a part of that. When you're drowning, when people are drowning, they will reach for a lifesaver no matter who's handing it out, okay? So this is what the U.S. does, and we're very good at doing that. But then we take control.
These questions of war, I suggested earlier, should be part of our discussion in this election season, the quadrennial that we're in the midst of the United States. We have 6 months more of it until the general election. I mentioned during Ron's comments early on this evening that it was my view that one should vote against all incumbents, with the idea, of course, that Hillary Clinton is an incumbent and that her policies are essentially those of the Obama and Bush administrations. They're in continuity with that, and the only interesting question is, will there be any challenge to that continuity? Voting against incumbents, I must say, is my suggestion. It's not an aware position. Aware is concerned about informing people about America's wars and the consequences of them. What to do in an election season is another matter. I think voting against incumbents, state and federal, is indeed quite the right thing to do, in part because in Illinois, at least, the Democrats are as bad as the neoliberal governor. That's true even though we've now seen a movement in Champaign-Urbana for a progressive Democrat group. Certainly being progressive is all very nice. Unfortunately, the progressive Democrat group seems to be in the business of delivering Democratic votes to Hillary Clinton. It's a front for the Clinton campaign. I hope that's not true, and I hope that they will consider other possibilities to the pro-war, pro-Wall Street Clinton campaign, but they don't seem to. I think they are rather hijacking the word progressive for the Clinton campaign, and I might say that we have some indications about that through our own local representative, Carol Ammons, who acquiesced in an attempt, in a successful attempt by the government of Israel to convince the Illinois legislature to use state monies, essentially, to prevent action against Israeli apartheid. Now, that's quite an amazing involvement of Israel and the Israel lobby in state politics, and it's a suggestion of how spineless, how supine the so-called Democratic progressives are, that they didn't oppose it. They didn't vote against it. So I think these questions of war and peace come down indeed to the local level, and they certainly do if the progressive Democrats in Illinois are simply an adjunct to the warmongering Clinton campaign. There are alternatives. The Green Party will have a presidential candidate, more than likely, probably Jill Stein, who was a recent guest in Champaign-Urbana. And the Green Party has other candidates too. Our own colleague, the appropriately named David Green, is running for the state Senate seat in this district. He's in fact gathering signatures at Lincoln Square in order to get his candidacy on the ballot. It's very difficult in Illinois to get a candidate on the ballot unless you belong to the Republican or Democrat parties. So recommend, look for David at Lincoln Square and at the upcoming markets and so forth in order to sign his petition and the petition for Jill Stein of the Green Party.
Excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but he's been at, yesterday he was at the Champaign Library, and he was very successful, and I think he's back there today, right now as we speak. Also Sundays, we are out in front of Radio Maria and Kopi Cafe. Did I say it right this time? Yeah, gathering signatures. And Friday, we will be at the Quad on campus during a May Day demonstration, or we'll be there at noon gathering signatures. And if anyone is interested in gathering signatures on the petition, let me know. I can be reached, Karen Aram, my name as you see it on the AWARE program, at hotmail.com. I'm the person in this area to contact, and I'll see to it that you get a petition to sign up for.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Let me endorse in general the notion that it's a good idea to circulate the elites, as they say, and to look very skeptically at those who want to be continued in office indefinitely. At the same time, we have this perennial proposal of term limits for people, and I'm not sure whether to say that's cool or that sucks, but there are problems with it. It must be applied with discrimination and discernment, and just in general, I think it's a good idea to get fresh faces. Because after people have been in office for a while, there's this very human tendency to sort of think that they own the office and they're there because they deserve to be. And that's extremely dangerous to a democracy, I think.
On the other hand, is it democratic? I don't know. I asked that question
Yeah,
of someone
right,
as well,
right.
so I don't know.
The best book on Hillary Clinton, one of the very good books on Hillary Clinton in this election season, is by Doug Henwood, and the book is called My Turn,
Yeah.
which suggests the truth of what Ron says. Of course, you can apply a term limit very easily by voting out an incumbent. You know, we don't need laws for that, just vote against them. And as I say, that's my suggestion in general. So we
But there's always
like
an
to-
incumbent advantage in
There is
elections.
indeed.
Yes.
That's right. That's all the more reason you should vote against those incumbents and vote for what you want, and even if you don't get it, and that's better than voting for what you don't want and getting it, as Eugene Debs said. One anniversary we might mention today, we were talking about just before we went on the air. This is the anniversary of this day in 1937 when the ancient Basque in Spain, well, that's the argument, but the Basque city of Guernica was bombed and largely obliterated by German and Italian air forces at the behest of the Spanish nationalists during the Civil War, killing many people. It was one of the first examples of aerial bombardment of civilians in a conflict, which of course the U.S. is the past master of today. It was famously depicted in Picasso's painting Guernica, which many people have seen. That painting now hangs in the UN Security Council chambers. Possibly the world's most famous anti-war artwork. It was covered up by officials when Colin Powell was due to speak about the Iraq War in 2003. So today is the anniversary of Guernica, and it's clear who the descendants of those city bombers of 1937 are today. You've been watching Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of AWARE, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 17th week of 2016. Another week in which the Obama administration's drone assassination program, the most extensive global terrorism campaign the world has yet seen, is paralleled by overwhelming police killings in the U.S., far beyond what happens in other countries. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett, thanks to whom also this program and others like it will be available on YouTube, and see the Facebook page for AWARE for articles referred to by the panel and announcements of upcoming events. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government which the rest of the world knows about but Americans don't: Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the rest, who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael Bay, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.